Adekunle Fajuyi occupies a unique, almost mythical place in Nigerian history. He is largely viewed as this gallant officer who, in the midst of an episode of bloodletting among Nigerian soldiers, refused to stand aside as his commander-in-chief was being led to the slaughter, and instead opted to share the fate of a brutal death at the hands of the renegade soldiers. And although some participants are witnesses to the event in Ibadan on July 29, 1966, adamantly expressed the view that Fajuyi, like Major General Aguiyi-Ironsi, had already been earmarked for death, the legacy of a soldier possessed of physical and moral courage remains essentially unimpaired.
Hi guys, welcome to Africa's Story. On today's episode, we revisit the tragic history of Colonel Adekunle Fajuyi, a great hero of Nigerian history. Do stay tuned and enjoy the ride.
The background of the death of Lieutenant Colonel Francis Adekunle Fajuyi was that of a country in turmoil. A mutiny by middle-ranking army officers on January 15, 1966 had led to the overthrow of a civilian government which had ruled Nigeria since it had become formally independent from British rule in October 1960. But the majors at the heart of the coup had not assumed power since they were opposed by Major General Johnson Aguiyi-Ironsi, the general officer commanding the Nigerian army, to whom they eventually surrendered. Ironsi had had the mantle of national leadership trusted on him when the civilian rulers had voluntarily transferred power to the military. However, the narrative that Ironsi's assumption of power had been the accidental culmination of a chain of events was one which came to be doubted by many in the country. True, the majors had terminated the rule of a government which had been plagued by accusations of incompetence and corruption. But the choices they had made in regard to the figures they had selected for elimination appeared to be grossly slanted. In short, most of the assassinated politicians came from the northern region, while the coup was led by officers of mainly Igbo ethnicity, the dominant group in the Nigeria's eastern region. And Ironsi himself, an Igbo, had been handed the power by an acting vice president, an Igbo, who was representing the Igbo president, Nnamdi Azikiwe, who conveniently, critics assumed, had been abroad by the time of the mutiny. The soldiers who surrounded Government House Ibadan in the early hours of Friday, July 29th, did so with a sense of vengeance. They hailed from the northern region and felt aggrieved by the fact that several senior northern army officers had been assassinated by the mutineers who had struck in January. The commanding officer of the Ibadan-based 4th Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Abogo Lagema, had been murdered during the coup. Composed in the main of soldiers of northern origin, they had refused to obey the orders of the officers appointed by Ironsi to replace him because he was Igbo. This act of dissent was a hairbringer of what would transpire on the day of the murder of Fajuyi and Ironsi. They sided over the fact that Ironsi had failed to put the January conspirators on trial, and that while in custody, the likes of Major Chukwuma Kaduna Nzogo were being paid their salaries and supposedly were enjoying a relatively comfortable existence. The northern officers had also grumbled over certain promotions Ironsi had made which were construed as favoring officers of his ethnic group, even though chief complainers such as Lieutenant Colonel Murtala Mohammed, who would be among the leaders of the counter-coup of July, had been beneficiaries. There was a feeling that the north needed to strive in order to preempt another coup by Igbos aimed at consolidating their grip on power. The dissatisfaction and suspicion in the army reflected the wider feeling of grievance among northerners who reacted with fury at Ironsi's decision to promulgate a decree in May which transformed the federal structure of Nigeria into a unitary one. It was interpreted as the completion of an elaborate plot designed to entrench Igbo hegemony. This, as they perceived it, had been achieved through control of the army, in which Igbos were preponderant in the officer class, as well as through the mechanism of a unified civil service in regard to which the less educated northerners would be unable to compete with higher attained Igbos. Adekunle Fajuyi, an ethnic Yoruba, had been appointed by Ironsi as the governor of the western region. He had hosted a cocktail party of the 28th to mark the conclusion of Ironsi's nationwide tour aimed at consulting with Nigeria's traditional rulers about the situation in the country. The northern Muslim emirs, in particular, sought reassurances about the direction that the country was heading. Fajuyi, like others in Government House, that early morning were likely roused by the sound of gunfire outside the building. He sent messages to the guardhouse and to his aide-de-camp, one Lieutenant Umar, a northerner. Most of the staff were northerners, and they were part of the coup, which had already claimed the lives of Igbo soldiers at the garrison in the city of Abeokuta. Umar falsely reported back that all was well. Fajuyi met with Ironsi, and it quickly became apparent that they were surrounded by troops with hostile intent. They had taken positions from all vantage points. Some were nestled in treetops, while others lay around the grounds in combat posture. A 106mm gun, an anti-tank weapon, was positioned in support. The entrances and exits were blocked. They intended for no one to escape.
If you find this video worthwhile, please take out some time to smash a like and subscribe to the channel, as it goes a long way with supporting our efforts. Thank you. Now let's get back to the video.
Major Theophilus Danjuma, who was coordinating the siege, resisted calls from impatient non-commissioned officers to storm Government House and was content with arresting those who intermittently emerged from the building on errands on behalf of the governor and the head of state. His aim, he would later claim, was to arrest Fajuyi and Ironsi. But when Lieutenant Colonel Hilary Njoku, the Igbo commander of the 2nd Brigade in Lagos, was sighted leaving, a burst of machine gun fire was aimed at him. He sustained a leg injury but managed to escape. Frantic calls were placed to officers around the country to explain their dire predicament. An attempt to get a helicopter to rescue them came to nothing. Fajuyi was the first to make his way to the living room, where he paced up and down in full uniform. He summoned Ironsi's Air Force aide-de-camp, Captain Andrew Wankwo, and told him to go outside to find out what was happening. Wankwo met Major Danjuma, who told him he wanted to see Ironsi. It was during this prolonged tense conversation that Fajuyi came outside to find out why Wankwo didn't return. Danjuma recounted the following conversation taking place between Fajuyi and himself. Danjuma said, "Sir, you are under arrest, raise your hands." Fajuyi replied, "What do you want?" Danjuma said, "I want the Supreme Commander." Fajuyi replied, "Promise me that no harm will come to him." End of conversation. Danjuma agreed, but objections were raised by a number of NCOs who felt that Fajuyi ought to have been detained and not allowed to go back in. Danjuma noted this and produced a grenade, informing Fajuyi that if he made a false move, he would blow both of them up. So Danjuma, grenade in hand and walking behind Fajuyi, made his way to meet Ironsi in the company of a handful of NCOs. After disarming 2 police guards at the stairs, they made their way up to the living room, which was situated on the 1st floor. When they encountered Ironsi, Danjuma saluted him, and an argument ensued between both men over Danjuma's complaints that Ironsi had not kept his promise to court-martial the mutinous of January. Fajuyi reportedly interjected with repeated reminders that Danjuma had assured Ironsi of his safety. Ironsi was then seized. He was relieved of his trademark crocodile staff, and his Major General's pips and shirts were torn from him. Ironsi, Fajuyi, and Ironsi's military aides, Wankwo and Lieutenant Sani Bello, had their hands tied behind their backs with telephone wires. Danjuma, who had given Fajuyi assurances that there would be no bloodshed, then claimed to have instructed an adjutant of the 4th Battalion to take Fajuyi and Ironsi to a guest house on a nearby cattle ranch. But he recalled an NCO impatiently tapping him on the shoulders with the butt of a rifle and took the prisoners from him. They were then spirited away in 2 of what formed a convoy of 3 vehicles. He was forced to hitchhike back to the barracks. However, another account has Danjuma entering one of the vehicles and being part of the convoy until waving them on and heading back for the barracks. They entered Lalupon, a town on the outskirts of Ibadan, and disembarked at a location on the outskirts of a forest. Fajuyi led the way as he and others, all now stripped of their shirts and repeatedly beaten, were marched along a narrow footpath. When he stumbled and fell as he attempted to cross a small stream, the response of some of his captors was to beat him. By now, both Fajuyi and Ironsi were so weakened by the beatings that they could hardly stand up. They were laid face down on earth before every man was executed with a burst of stun gun. It was a callous, gruesome end. The bodies of both were left at the spot of their execution until the next day, when a group of northern soldiers buried them in shallow graves, discovered a few days later by a unit of police special branch. They were disinterred and reburied at the military cemetery in Ibadan. No official announcement of the death of either man was made by succeeding government, led by Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon, a Christian northerner who had been Ironsi's chief of staff. A second exhumation would occur at the beginning of 1967, After the meeting in Aburi between Gowon and members of Nigeria's post-Ironsi government and Lieutenant Colonel Ojukwu, the military governor of Eastern Region, who disputed the legitimacy of the regime, which had succeeded Ironsi's. Both Fajuyi and Ironsi were accorded state burials, with each being buried in his hometown, Fajuyi in Abeokuta and Ironsi in Umuahia. A civil war would nonetheless ensue, and in many respects the counter-coup of July 1966 was only completed with the collapse of Biafra, the name given to the seceded Eastern Region in January 1970. With soldiers acting as death squads, linchpins and assassins, the episodes of violence unleashed within the Nigerian army during the mutinies of 1966 were not of the sort which by any standards would confer glory on the protagonists. But in the personage of Fajuyi, one of the victims, a story began to evolve of courage and sacrifice. The coup of July was viewed by northern officers as a revenge operation against their Igbo counterparts. And in this expertise, they bore no animus against Yoruba soldiers. Thus, in the ensuing onslaught, Yorubas were largely spared the fate that would befall their Igbo comrades. The modus operandi was to separate Yoruba soldiers and others of non-Igbo ethnicity from Igbo ones before enacting their brand of vengeance on Igbo victims. Of course, Yorubas such as Major Benjamin Adekunle, who made efforts to enable Igbos to escape their executioners, put themselves in danger of being killed, but provided they stepped aside, they will not be harmed. It is from this background that the widely related story that Fajuyi, who was not meant to die, had informed his captors that if they were going to kill the man who was his guest, they would have to do the same to him. But this was not the story told in the immediate aftermath of his murder. Indeed, there was a little public discourse on the matter, given the muteness of the central government, which made no official announcement of his death. Many Nigerians were not aware that he and Ironsi had been killed. However, after his state funeral, much attention began to be focused on Fajuyi's conduct before his execution. Beginning with the book Fajuyi the Great, an official publication of the Information Division of the Western Regional Government in 1967, the narrative of Fajuyi choosing to die with Ironsi firmly entered the realm of public consciousness. Over the decades, it was consolidated by other works with titles such as A Great Hero and A Tribute to Gallantry. In Fajuyi the Martyred Soldier, which was a publication in 1996, the author, Sanmi Ajiki, resorted to artistic license when recreating the scene where Fajuyi was arrested with Ironsi with the following dialogue. I make bold to declare to you that I am with you, soul, spirit and body. And mark my words, whatever happens to you today happens to me. I am your true friend, dear JET, like the dove to the pigeon, and by the grace of our good God, so will I humbly, yet proudly remain to the very end. Ironsi replied, Yes, Francis, I retain my absolute confidence in you. I have never for once doubted your integrity. End of dialogue. Such dialogue does not sound plausible, given the tense and chaotic circumstances of the arrest of both men. None of those involved in Fajuyi's arrest who went on record to claim that Fajuyi had asked to stand aside while Ironsi was taken away. Indeed, according to William Welby and Theophilus Danjuma, Fajuyi was specifically earmarked for death because he was believed by the mutineers to have had a hand in the planning of the first mutiny. They also heard that Fajuyi had acted to block attempts to bring the general mutineers to trial. According to William Welby, he says, and I quote, "We arrested him and we arrested Ironsi. We suspected him of being party to the general coup. You remember the battle group course, which was held at Abeokuta? Fajuyi was the commander of the battle group course. All those who took part in the general coup were those who had taken part in that course. He gave us the impression that the battle course was arranged for the coup, so he had to suffer it too. I am sorry about that, but that is the nature of the life of a military man." End of quote. Danjuma also claimed that Fajuyi was in command of another training camp in the northern town of Kachia, during which time Major Nzogo went through a mock assault on a house which northern officers took to be rehearsals for the attack on the home of Ahmadu Bello, the Sardana of Sokoto, the most powerful politician in the north. The chaps could not stomach Fajuyi, such that if there was anybody who would die first, as far as they were concerned, it was Fajuyi, not even Ironsi. Researchers have concluded that both Danjuma and Welby's accounts were riddled with inaccuracies. For instance, Fajuyi was not involved in the Kachia training camp which took place in mid-April 1966 when Uzogu was in detention. And while Danjuma may have mistaken the training camp for that of the battle course which was held in September 1966, only one out of the 7 instructors, Major Adewale Ademoyega, and one of the 13 attendees, Captain Ben Boulier, were participants in the January mutiny. Several of the attending officers were from the north. Nonetheless, in the atmosphere of civil distrust and rumor-mongering as existed in the army in the build-up to the counter-coup, factual information often took a backseat. Still, evidence of Fajuyi's involvement in the January mutiny came from one of the mutinous 5 leaders, Ademoyega, a Yoruba, and the only non-Igbo among the leaders, would write in his book Why We Struck that Fajuyi was aware of the coup and supported it by making suggestions to the plotters as how it could best be carried out. He further claimed that the only reason Fajuyi had not been an active participant was because of a posting. Importantly, he confirmed that Fajuyi did in fact strenuously oppose all efforts made by Ironsi-led Supreme Military Council to bring the plotters to trial. A more accurate rendition of Fajuyi's conduct during the events of July 29th and the lead-up to the mutiny staged on that day arguably does not diminish the man. Pushing to one side the embellished story that he positively elected to face death with Ironsi rather than abandon his host to death, it is clear that Fajuyi acted in a physical, courageous way when he stepped outside of the government house to confront the rebellious soldiers when attempting to ascertain what had happened to Captain Nwankwo, Ironsi's ADC. It is also clear that he believed that as a matter of honor, he was morally duty-bound to do what he could to protect his guest General Ironsi, hence his repeated entreaties to Major Danjuma to assure him that no harm will come to Ironsi. Born on 26 June 1926, a native of Ado-Ekiti, Francis Adekunle Fajuyi was originally a teacher and clerk. He joined the army in 1943, and as a sergeant in the Nigerian Signal Squadron, Royal West African Force Frontier, he was awarded the British Empire Medal in 1951 for helping to contain a mutiny in his unit over food rations. He was trained at the Eaton Hall Officer Candidate School in the United Kingdom in July 1954 until November 1954, when he was short service commissioned. Like Ironsi, Fajuyi was a veteran of the United Nations peacekeeping operation in Congo. He was the first Nigerian officer to be awarded an international military citation when, as a major, he was the recipient of the Military Cross for leading his company in combat on November 27, 1960, and also for subsequently intricating it from an ambush during operations on January 3, 1961. On completion of the Congo operations, Fajuyi became the first indigenous commander of the 1st Battalion in Enugu, a position he held just before the first coup of January 1966 when he was posted to Abeokuta as a garrison commander. When Major General Ironsi emerged as a new commander-in-chief on 17 January 1966, he appointed Fajuyi the first military governor of the Western region. The story of Fajuyi gallantly electing to die was perhaps consciously developed as a means of emphasizing the virtue of gallantry in the midst of the savagery unleashed in the Nigerian army. But if the preeminent function of the competent and objective documentarian is to clarify the past, then it is imperative that myths surrounding the historical figures are laid to rest. In the case of Francis Adekunle Fajuyi, that time is long overdue. Thanks for watching the video, guys. I would really love to know your thoughts about the tragic death of Adekunle Fajuyi. What do you think about the accusations by the northern officers like William Welby and Danjuma of his involvement in the 1966 coup of January 15th? Please let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Don't forget to smash a like and subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification button to get more content like this about African history. This is Nano's African History. See you in the next one.